Greetings from New York City and Columbia Business School Executive Education. I'm very happy to be here today with my good friend, Rita McGrath. Happy to be with you again.
Delighted to be here.
My name is Scott Gardner, and before I introduce Rita, I'd like to go over just a few quick logistics for today's webinar. Weak signals anticipating an inflection point before it's too late. If you look at your screen right now, a recording will be made available after the webinar. If you'd like to tweet about this webinar, please do so at #CBSExecEd. And finally, most importantly, please submit those questions to the Q&A box. Rita and I will get to as many of those as possible in the last 10 minutes. Thank you. So it's my pleasure to introduce Rita Gunther McGrath. She's a best-selling author, a sought-after speaker, and a longtime faculty member of Columbia Business School Executive Education. She is widely recognized as the premier expert on leading innovation and growth during times of uncertainty. She has received the #1 Achievement Award for Strategy from the prestigious Thinkers 50 and has been consistently named one of the world's top 10 management thinkers in its biannual ranking. As a consultant to CEOs, her work has had a lasting impact on strategy and growth programs of Fortune 500 companies worldwide. She received her PhD from the Wharton School and has degrees with honors from Barnard College and the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. Rita is the author of the best-selling The End of Competitive Advantage, and her new book, Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen, will be coming out this September. Very exciting.
It is exciting.
It's great to be with you today. Now, I'm going to leave the stage in a minute, and I'll rejoin you for the questions. But before I do, you and I have known each other almost 2 decades now. We've been in hundreds of classrooms. We've met thousands of executive students. The one thing I know about your program, Leading Strategic Growth and Change, is that it's in constant evolution. You're constantly evolving it. There's a core message, but you're constantly evolving it. So tell us how your new book, Seeing Around Corners, is going to speak to your new program.
Oh, thanks so much for asking, Scott, and I'll see you in a bit.
See you in a bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here to discuss some of the ways that the Seeing Around Corners material is going to be incorporated in Leading Strategic Growth and Change. And it really has to do with what I call the new Strategy Playbook. And the reason that's so important is because I think a lot of the way that we have thought about strategy up until now assumes a lot more stability and a lot more certainty than people are actually living with. And this is an illustration. This shows market share shifts in the gaming business, beginning with arcade games. And in the beginning, the game and the software, in a sense, that it was built to run were the same thing. It was mechanical. The first big change then was we went to situations where the software and the hardware were separate. Then we went to handheld situations. Then we went to games played on mobile devices, games played in virtual reality. And what matters here is the pattern. So the whole course and my book is really about those moments when things change, when there's an inflection point and things shift. And what that does is it calls into question the taken for granted assumptions that you may have made about your business. So here's a whole category of new kinds of players that are disrupting incumbent situations. So as an example, Dollar Shave Club very successfully used some of these inflection points in business to create a new business model, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But an inflection point can be a real boon strategically. It can take your business to new heights, or if you miss it, it can cause your business to go into erosion. So that's a real theme that we'll be pursuing in my Leading Strategic Growth and Change course, something I think our viewers should take into account. And things like Google, YouTube, Facebook, all these things have really changed the assumption about what reach is possible for what kind of investment. If you wanted to get a message to 2 billion people, you used to have to be a movie studio or a television production company with all of that equipment. Today, anybody in their garage with a smartphone can do it. So it really changes the assumptions that we make in business. So here's Dollar Shave Club. An entrepreneur, Mike Dubin, basically started this thing with a couple of his buddies, very little initial investment capital, used social channels incredibly skillfully to get the message out that, why should we be paying all this money to incumbent Gillette? when we can create a subscription. You get these razors with you, every month. They get delivered right to your door, a direct-to-consumer experience. And it was incredibly well received and incredibly successful. And a couple of years ago, Unilever paid $1 billion for this startup, which at the time employed something like 50 people. Now think of that in contrast to Gillette, which about a decade before paid $57 billion to acquire Gillette by Procter & Gamble. A huge success. And the results have been remarkable. This market share decline that Gillette experienced because of Dollar Shave Club and the other entrants such as Harry's in the shaving arena was a 16% decline in their market share. And that's pretty amazing when you consider basically two guys in a garage inventing something that makes mighty Gillette less powerful. And this is just one of a number of direct-to-consumer business models, companies like Bonobos, that was acquired by Walmart, or Harry's in shaving, which was acquired by Edgeware. A whole category of these companies that are completely rethinking their models of customer relationships. And I think that's something we can all really learn from. So the tools of strategy that we have inherited often assume that your industry is going to be the biggest predictor of your success. And I'm going to argue that's a really limiting way of looking at your business. I mean, what industry is Dollar Shave Club in? Are they a tech company? Are they a consumer products company? Are they you can ask that question. So the concept that I'd like to replace that with is something I call a competitive arena, where an arena represents some resources that you have that is being contested by various different players. So in the case of shaving, there's a budget for shaving that people have, and Dollar Shave Club and Gillette and their other competitors would like to get a piece of that dollar. How do you understand what's going to motivate them to spend with you rather than with your competitor? So a way to look at this is think about providing your customers, in Clay Christensen's terms, with solutions to jobs that they want to get done in their lives. So what they're buying is not as good a predictor of how they're going to behave as what is the job that they're in effect hiring your product or service to do for them. And once you think of a job as being hired by a customer rather than a customer buying something, it opens your mind to a whole new way of thinking. And that's something we really encourage people to consider, which is what is your competitive arena and how do you plan to contest it? So let's just take an example, clothing for teenagers. Think of your friendly local teenager and think of what clothing does for them. And in a lot of cases, the job that clothing does for teenagers is not the functional one, right? It's not to keep them warm or whatever. I mean, at some level, maybe. But it's more about communication. What tribe do I belong to? What tribe do I not belong to? It's how do I perceive others and how do others perceive me? It's an enormously important communicative job. Well, what's changed in that world from the last couple of decades has been teenagers are now using technology to communicate. And what are they doing with all that technology? Well, they're texting each other and they're sending pictures around and they're posting to social media. If a tree falls in the forest and it isn't on Instagram, did it actually happen? I mean, that kind of consideration. And what's happening now is that teens want to communicate fresh, different, I want to look different every time. I want to pose for that perfect Instagram selfie. What I want is, in effect, disposable clothing. And that has prompted a trend towards fast fashion. And I would argue the fast fashion trend became an inflection point sometime around the year 2000, 2002, when what you began to see was traditional department stores with their traditional pitch. Like come to our department store, you can browse the shelves, but the clothing you'll get will be high quality, high priced, durable, it'll last you a whole season. Teens aren't interested in that. And that, together with the rise of the internet and a number of other reasons that teens' shopping behavior began to switch, created a real inflection point. So when you think of who's winning in that world, it's organizations like Ross Stores. They're treasure hunt. They're inexpensive, cheap, and cheerful. You can go in there and find what you want. Other winners in this inflection point game would be Inditex, which is the parent company of Zara, and H&M. And here in the U.S., Forever 21. And so you see that inflection point really happening, right? Where the winners who got it quickly, learned respond to the fast fashion trend, learn to sort of tool their operations to succeed, did very well. And those companies, like traditional department stores that really didn't see it or ignored it or didn't pay attention, really kind of suffered from that change. So today, we're seeing a couple of things largely informed by the advent of digital technologies that are really shifting the assumptions underlying most businesses. So in automotive, not only are we seeing the shift to sort of autonomous vehicles and batteries maybe sometime in the future, but here now today we've got access to rides rather than having to own or rent a car. In the home, right, we've got home services on demand, and in the sort of buying area, we can get workforce on demand from Amazon, Mechanical Turk, and on. And all that this does is it basically means that assumptions about entry barriers, how much it would cost you to get into a business, have almost completely evaporated. If I see a customer pain point and I decide to go after it, I can assemble the assets I need to do that very, very quickly. And I can do it with virtually no investment. So what that means is the traditional entry barriers have almost completely evaporated. So a couple of things that I'm going to encourage my listeners to remember is today we're seeing the convergence of strategy and innovation. And Scott had asked me to talk about how the course has evolved. In Leading Strategic Growth and Change, what I'm including now is this connection between strategy, as we used to think of it, which is, where do we want to go as a company? What's our core value proposition? What's our core business? Now you can't talk about strategy without talking about innovation. And increasingly, you can't talk about innovation without talking about something involving digital. And I think the confluence of those three things is what I really try to design the course about. So we've got platform strategies that we talk about where you're trying to connect two sides of a two-sided market. We have an entire session on digital business models and how you think about creating them. We've got sessions on how do you manage the parent corporation when you may be the digital arm of an organization that's actually kind of in the conventional approach. How do you deal with that? So we've continually updated the course, and the late version of it is indeed the digital aspect of it. So I think to think about that, think about how digital really shifts the taken for granted assumptions that you may be making in your business, where, like Gillette, it took them really by surprise. And they're now being forced to deal with consumers the way consumers want to be dealt with, which is direct, authentic. I want to control the experience. I want to have it convenient. And I don't want to have to put up with going to a store, finding a retail salesperson to unlock the razor fortress for me, and having to shell out a whole pile of money for an everyday product that I need. Instead, I'm going to go to somebody who can meet that need simply, conveniently, cheaply, and so on. And this is all mobilized by digital technologies. So ignore that at your peril, I would say. Last thing to talk on, and then we'll invite Scott back for some more questions, is one of the critical reasons that organizations miss coming strategic inflection points is that they're focused inside. They're focused on their business, they're focused on their email, they're focused on the meetings they're having, and they're not thinking enough about what's going on at the edges of their organizations. And Andy Grove wrote a wonderful book back in the 90s called Snow Melts from the Edges. And what he meant by that was that, if you want to see where change is coming, that you want to go out to the edges of your organization and see what's happening. Oh, I misspoke. The book is called Only the Paranoid Survive. The thesis in the book was that you need to really get out to the edges and see what's happening. So one of the things I talk about in the book are 8 practices that you can use to make sure you're not being blindsided by what's going on at the periphery. So one of the observations I'd make about strategic inflection points is even though they feel as though they happen overnight, generally you've got time. And this connects this idea of what's going on at the edges of your organization that might be important for you, maybe not right now, but 2-3 years from now. And that's where you need to be looking out for the Dollar Shave Clubs of the world, or the Bonobos of the world, or the other kind of digitally enabled, digital native companies that could come and just make what you're doing less attractive, less affordable, less convenient. And you really need to be paying attention to that. So here's a specific example which illustrates a second dimension, which is that your organization often will conspire against you to actually see what's going on. And the higher up you get in the organization, the more this is likely to happen. So some years back, the Gap retail clothing store decided to try to give its workers more predictable hours. And a New York Times reporter wanted to know, well, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to give workers more predictable hours in your retail stores? So the first answer was, corporate. Corporate puts out a mandate on Tuesday that nationally we're going to roll out a promotion for skinny jeans on Thursday, and I've got people in the store, trying to get the skinny jeans to the right place and get the placards up and all that stuff. But the second thing they said was really interesting. Executive visits. Executive visits, we know they're coming, and we have double overtime to get the store ready to show to these executives so we're not embarrassed by what's going on in there. So think about this. Here's a executive trying to do the right thing, right? Go out to the field, talk to customers, see what's going on in the stores. And the store that they're visiting is not the store that you and I go into. It's a store with 2 or 3 times the hours of labor in it. So how are you going to pick up any useful detail about what's really happening in that environment? So what I would recommend, right, is how do you personally get out to the edges and see what's going on in an unvarnished, unsort of protected place? So in the book, I talk about a lot of other practices that you can use to do this. So the first thing I'd like to leave you with respect to inflection points, is they don't happen overnight. What we perceive as an inflection point today usually has roots that go back sometimes decades. So a brilliant example of this is Nike. Nike, as you know, global manufacturer of athletic apparel, sneakers and other things. Nike began to experiment with direct-to-consumer models back in the 90s. I mean, they had a partnership with Apple, they had Nike Plus, they had a bunch of other things they were doing. Today, Nike sells about a third, just shy of a third, of its products through its direct consumer market. But had they not been experimenting at the edges, had they not already begun to get on that trajectory, by the time the strategic inflection point that is direct to consumer has happened, they would have missed it. And they would have been at the wrong end of that inflection point. So I think it's getting involved early, making sure that you're on top of it, and seeing what's going on at the edges, because these things don't happen overnight. The phrase I use to talk about this comes from Ernest Hemingway, who said in one of his books, The Snow Also Rises, one character asks another, well, how did you go bankrupt? And the response was, gradually and then suddenly. And when we look at strategic inflection points, that's exactly the pattern. So one of the things I try to promote both in the book and in the course is how do you pick up those weak signals early by being where the inflection points are, by making small exploratory investments that I call options, to try something out, to see what's going on long before it's kind of at your doorstep and the alarm bells are going off and your business model is now being super challenged. How do you make sure you're in the right place at those early stages where the snow is melting? So thank you from me. Please do be in touch if you have questions. I love hearing from our listeners. And let me invite Scott back for the Q&A part of this
Very
topic.
excited to get back up here because so many questions.
Oh, fabulous.
So many great questions, okay?
Fabulous.
So I'm looking at a lot of themes, and let's get to it as soon as we can. Mm-hmm. The first one I'm seeing is from Keith. And I think this is the place that they're all going to want to start. So it's, what practical action can you take to identify or forecast a potential inflection point in my business industry arena?
Sure. So what I would look at is that any business has an envelope of constraints that it operates within. And you develop your business plan based on those constraints, right? And so your key metrics, your key performance indicators, everything you do that tells you how good you are or how bad you are, or what's going to lead to success, is built around those. So something like digital has the effect of completely erasing those constraints. So what I would encourage you to do is look at what you measure and ask yourself the question, if I were to do that job for my customer without those constraints, what would I be doing? What would I be doing differently? And that's where I would start looking. So I'll give you an illustration because that makes it more concrete. I've been working with a furniture company. I won't mention who they are, but they're a very traditional retailer. They make furniture that goes out to customers. And we did a major workshop with them saying, well, if you were really digitally enabled, what could you do for your customers that would be different? And we came up with some incredible ideas, right? That we could dispense with the furniture store. We could have a demo store. You could have a design studio and have the furniture custom made and custom delivered. You could have a direct-to-consumer model where they actually, create the furniture that they want online, and then you create it and ship it directly to them. So it just opens the envelope of opportunities that you may be limited by if you're just looking at your industry or your lens. So I would start there. I would start with what are we thinking are our current assumptions about what's constraining us, and then if we took those constraints away and started this sort of business or industry fresh, how would we come at it today?
Great. All right, so this is a bit of a chicken-egg question. What comes first? From Javier. What comes first, strategy or innovation?
I think they have to work together. Of course, I would say that. Well, I think your strategy is fundamentally derived from two things, right? The desire to achieve certain objectives under conditions of resource constraints and competition. So if you don't have resource constraints and you don't have competition, why do you even need a strategy? Just go innovate like crazy. That's great. Right. But usually the strategy should be driving your innovative efforts. And by the way, one thing to watch out for in digital especially is there's a tendency right now, because digital is so buzzy and everybody's excited about blockchain and AI and da-da-da. It's what we call shiny object syndrome, right? So don't do that. Start with your strategy and say, okay, given that digital has this constraint-changing property to it, how would we fit digital into that strategy? Now, your strategy really needs to start with your customer. So I would say start with your customer, let that inform your strategy, and then think about what does that imply for where you need innovation.
So outside in thinking.
Outside in, definitely.
Yeah, okay, great. So just so that we make sure that we're touching all the folks that are watching right now, Barbara asks, can this also relate to service-based industries? So this is holistic, right?
Yeah.
The book is related to any industry.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So let's just make sure everyone knows.
Yeah, no, and then, increasingly, by the way, even industries that we thought of traditionally as product-based industries, they're becoming service businesses. So back to furniture, there are several startups now aimed mostly at millennials and younger people who are actually offering furniture as a service. So kind of think Rent the Runway, but for furniture. Right. So you can furnish your apartment. Let's say you're on a 9-month gig or you don't think you'll be there longer than a year. You can rent the furniture by the month. When you're done, you just call them up, they take it away. And so here's a traditional product business for making furniture that's now actually turned into a service business. And I think that is very much enabled by digital.
It's like the opposite of renting a furnished apartment. Rent the apartment and then get it furnished
exactly,
and then have it taken away. You don't have to have no responsibility.
No responsibility at all, right.
Very interesting.
It is.
All right, so this question was one of the first ones that came in from Michael. So talking about your shave example, shaver's example is certainly disruptive. Gillette has launched a Gillette Shave Club. Bic has just launched a subscription model with Amazon. Does this follower strategy make sense? Copying what the disruptor has created and surfing that wave?
It can. And in a commodity business like shaving, there's plenty of volume to go around, right? What I think is interesting is how fast that copying happens. It used to be if you innovated something, like the very first Apple computer or something, it took a while before somebody caught up to you. Today you can have new competitors within a week after you've demonstrated the viability of the business model. So it can work depending on your goals. If your goal is just to generate some income in a fairly limited space, then of course copying can work. If your goal is to dominate the market, that's much more challenging if you come from behind.
When you talk about fast fashion or these kind of things, is there also do we have to be aware of fast business? People who just want fast business know that it's a niche thing. You're talking about those niche, what's hot right now. And how does that affect somebody who does not have that sort of business looking at that as a disruptor?
Sure. So I think one of the real interesting challenges today is businesses are run by different rules, right? Based on what their investors expect of them, based on what their capital constraints are. So back to my furniture company, their position is basically, look, my investing community isn't going to give me the same leeway that somebody like an Amazon gets, right? I mean, Amazon's had cheap capital that they're able to completely reinvest in their business for years. So I think part of the dilemma is how do you chart that path between what's expected of you to be a profitable, normal business when your competition may be one of these fast businesses that they're building their business to sell it, not necessarily to produce a product. It's a really thorny strategy problem. The best I can advise you is try to think of some way that you can be more relevant to the lives of your end consumers, your end customers, than these more fast companies can be.
Right. And it may not even be the same customer base?
Might not even be the same customer base, yeah.
So, I mean, there's just a lot for people to think. I'm just trying to look at it holistically for
right.
everybody.
Yeah.
All right, so, this is general from VJ. what are the leading indicators of inflection points? Do you have like a top 3 or 4 that?
Yeah, I think when the constraints are changed dramatically, typically by something that happens technologically. So I'll take another example. In traditional retail, right, your constraints were all about the square footage or square yardage or square meters of real estate that you occupied, and that became a huge issue in that business. The internet obviously has completely released that constraint. You can now conduct retail anywhere, even virtually. And so that would be a leading indicator that something potentially could really happen. Now, what's interesting also is there's a tendency in the early stages of people seeing this to overreact. So if we go back to the 90s, you may remember, Pets.com and Value America and WebVan and all these internet companies that just thought this retail apocalypse was upon us and we should invest and get big or go home. And we all know that was a disaster. So there's this tendency, and we're in the middle of this right now with digital. I think we've just got too much investment going into companies, not all of which can manage to survive, in the form of unicorns, these billion-dollar valued startups. And they can't all go public. So they're going to have to find some other exit, or they're going to have to just do what they've been doing, which is raise more capital and raise more capital and raise more capital. And I don't think that's sustainable. So I think what you want to look for is what is something happening that's going to change the constraints my company typically operates under. Usually it's technological.
Right. Well, then on that, theme, Tiffany asks, Rita, what is your perspective on a smaller digital native companies remaining competitive against digital behemoths like Amazon? Or should we expect further consolidation investment that forces those companies to seek acquisition by Amazon or other large digital companies in order to survive?
Yeah, well, that's been a big trend, right? So what you're seeing is a lot of these smaller companies have created a business model, demonstrated that it's viable, and yet they can't scale. They can't get to global reach. There's some things they can't do because that's sort of space that the bigger incumbents have been occupied. So we're seeing a whole wave of acquisitions. So Walmart, for example, has bought Jet.com, which had been founded by Mark Lowry, who was the founder of Diapers.com, which was acquired by Amazon. So I do think you're going to see this pattern where really committed incumbents will tend to go the acquisition route because they struggle so much with innovating internally.
So Mawash asked, does agility have a role to play in successfully looking around corners and adopting and adjusting?
Yes, it definitely does. And those of you interested in agility, I can highly recommend a book by my colleague Steve Denning called The Age of Agile, which is really worth a read. But
The Age of Agile.
The Age of Agile, yeah. This gets back to these 7 practices for seeing snow melting at the edges. And one of the practices, empowering small teams with small amounts of resource to do experimentation. And one of the real takeaways I hope you get from this session is you can't just sit in your office and sort of speculate. You actually have to be out at the edges of your organization running experiments. So what you're after is cheap, fast, low-cost learning engagements that are going to teach you more about what's going on. Another thing to really think about is stop trying to be right under uncertain circumstances. I have seen more human breath wasted about this need to be right than anything else. And what I would recommend instead is saying, well, we don't know, so let's go find out. And that's the mindset you want to bring to these kinds of uncertain circumstances.
Right. Well, and that, again, a tool, right? So in today's world, even if we are able to identify a strategic inflection point, there are multiple trajectories that business industry can take subsequently. So in today's dynamic business environment, which path would be taken that can change in a very short period of time, laying all preparation to waste? In such a background, this is a long question, but how does an organization prepare for such a wide range of futures?
Right. So what I recommend is that you manage a portfolio of experiments. So in your core business, you really want to be paying attention to, are the parameters changing there? In fact, is my core business now becoming a highly uncertain business? Then there are some where that's happening. But in general, your core business, you kind of know what to do there. Then you have candidates to be the next generation core business. And then kind of in the highest uncertainty space of all, you've got your options. And depending on how wide the uncertainty is that you're dealing with, that'll dictate how widely you want to place your options, which are those experiments I've been talking about.
Right. So we've got about 1 minute left, and I think, again, what I always try to do in these webinars is like, what do we do tomorrow? What do I do this afternoon? So a common theme of a few questions Jason has asked and Devanshu has asked, how do you sell this internally?
How do you sell it internally?
Yeah, how do you, so, you want to do this. And it sounds like a great idea, but what are some first steps and how do you do this internally?
I'd come up with some stories, some analogs, some things that cause people to say, oh, what would we do if that could happen to us? A very practical way of thinking about this is if you were to internally say, this is how I would destroy our business, why don't we do it for ourselves?
Right.
I think that would be a really compelling reason for people to start paying attention.
Right. And it's just, and you, like you said, it doesn't have to happen in one day.
No,
so that's what
not at all.
being at the edges gives you a little bit more, but you still have to look at the core. The core is your strategy, right? The edges are the innovation.
The edges are where things are happening that could affect your innovation.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks,
We're
everyone.
out of time, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And Rita, I look forward to working with you again.
I look
All
forward
right.
to working with you. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks a lot. Thank
Bye.
you.